Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. A few days ago I did a review of the AYN Odin 3, but in leading up to that review I did a ton of testing just to make sure I knew what I was talking about, and I ended up with way more footage than I could put in a review video, and so this video is going to be a compilation of all the different emulation and gaming testing that I did on this device. And the reason why I'm making this video today is to establish a baseline with the Snapdragon 8 Elite on the Odin 3 before we get any sort of custom drivers. So this is how it's going to work out of the box. As I showed in my review, there are some systems that are somewhat hit and miss, not because of the performance power of this chip, but because of the graphics drivers. And so this is going to be a more traditional and laid-back Retro Game Core video, where we're just going to test every system, starting at the very beginning and then working our way up. So grab your favorite snack and drink, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as we jump into RetroArch, I do have some notes that I'll carry over from the review video. Number one is being that when you first get this device set up, you want to go into the settings, into video, and make sure your output is set to Vulkan. This will improve the compatibility with some emulator cores, and it's also going to unlock the slang shaders instead of GLSL, which are more advanced and feature-packed. Starting with the most lightweight stuff like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, these are going to play absolutely fine. These games are going to play at a 7.5x scale, and the overall screen size is going to be 4.4 inches when scaled like this. I usually use the LCD 3x shader to give it a more grid-like effect, and then a light colorization as well. Now, because we're showing 10:9 content on a 16:9 display, that does mean we're going to have significant black bezels on the left and right. But thankfully, because it is an OLED display, the bezels are really inky black, and so it just kind of blends into the background for me once I get into a game. On the other side, Game Boy Advance is very similar in terms of setup, but looks completely different. This is a 3:2 aspect ratio system, and so it's going to have very minimal black bars on the left and right. I also do some similar tricks here with the LCD 3x shader, and then I also apply color correction to make this look more like the original Game Boy Advance. But yeah, everything's going to play fine just like this. Now, when it comes to playing other home console systems, those that played on a TV, I do a couple other different tricks. Now, I've made individual videos about this, like the CRT beam shader, as well as using just shaders in general. I'll leave those videos linked down below, but I'll give you a quick crash course right now. So first thing, you would want to go over into the settings menu in video and then go into synchronization. And then I like to turn on shader subframes to 2. This is a 120 Hz display, which means that we can use this feature. After that, once we got a game running, I'll go down into the shaders section, and then generally I will set 2 different shaders up at once with my Odin 3. So the first shader is going to be in the slang section. You will find it near the bottom. It's going to be under subframe BFI, and then find the one that says CRT Beam Simulator. Once you've got it loaded, I recommend going into the shader parameters, and then under LCD anti-retention, I turn this one off because it can affect the colorization as you're playing the game. It just looks a little bit weird. Same thing with scan direction. I set this to 0 so there is no scan line that goes across. And so this gives me just a cleaner image overall. And the beauty of using the CRT beam shader is that it allows for improved motion clarity without darkening the screen too much. After that, we're going to load a CRT effect shader on top of it. So we're going to go down here to Append Preset, then go down to Slang, and then CRT. There are a ton of different shaders within here, but my favorite, at least with a high-powered device like this, is the CRT Royale shader. There's a bunch of different options. I just use the vanilla one right here. Once I've got both of those loaded, then I like to go up here into Manage Presets and then Save Preset, and I like to actually save it as a global preset because basically every system is going to use this setup, and then for those that don't, I'll just make a specific shader set for those. And so in general, this is how I will play my games on RetroArch. It's going to give me improved motion clarity, and it has this nice in-depth CRT effect to it as well, and so I think it looks beautiful. Now, this will darken the screen a little bit. For example, if we press fast forward, you can see that it will get a little bit brighter, so this is what it is normally, and then when we use the CRT beam simulator, it's going to show like this. I think it's just a little bit of a darkening, and I think it still works really well on a very bright screen like the one on the Odin 3. And so that's how I play most of these retro systems, NES and Super Nintendo and Genesis, and I think it looks great. It makes it feel kind of like a small CRT CRT television. And there are a ton of different shader options that you have in that folder if you want to try out something besides the CRT Royale one, something with maybe a bit more of a geometric shape to it. But in general, I like the Royale one because it looks nice and sophisticated without messing with the screen too much. And of course, as you can imagine, performance here is going to be absolutely fine playing these older systems, and so I think it's a great fit. One of my favorite systems to play like this are arcade games, because I think the CRT effect just makes it look a lot more realistic, and then the OLED colors really pop as well, and so this is probably one of my favorite systems to play on an OLED device like this that has a lot of power that allows me to use these additional shaders. Now moving on from there, let's talk about some of the more 3D or intensive systems. We'll start with PS1. Lately, I've been using the Beetle PSX HW core. That allows me to upscale, and I find it to be very accurate too. Unfortunately, with that one, I did find that it had some shadow issues, and so it didn't really play all that well. And so instead, I just used the regular Beetle PSX core. This one doesn't have upscaling, but because we're using that CRT effect, it really doesn't matter all that much because I think it looks more authentic this way anyway. There are other cores that will work fine, like Swan Station, which does allow for upscaling, so you have that route to go as well, but I found that this effect in general looks pretty good. It's a similar story with Nintendo 64, but like I mentioned in the review, this one is a little bit more limited. You basically can only use the Mupen core within RetroArch, and you have to use the Angry Lion backend plugin. This one also doesn't allow for upscaling, but like with PS1, I think that when using the CRT Royale shader, it still looks really nice. You could always use something like the standalone Mupen emulator with this device, and that'll work fine, and you'll be able to upscale, but it has more limited shader options, and it also doesn't have retro achievements and some of the other features that you can find within RetroArch. So it is a bit of a compromise to play it on RetroArch, but I think in general it's still a pretty good Nintendo 64 experience. Now other systems like Dreamcast are going to look a lot better. You're going to be able to use upscaling with the Flycast core, as well as widescreen cheats to blow it up to 16:9, and you can also layer on the CRT beam and CRT shaders too. So this is kind of the best of the best in that we can get all these upscaled tricks through emulation, but still a more retro look to it altogether. The most advanced system that I typically will play in RetroArch is going to be Sega Saturn. I use the Beetle Saturn core, which is more accurate but more demanding. The beauty here is that we can kind of throw the kitchen sink at Sega Saturn. We can use the most demanding core, the most demanding shaders, and then also the CRT beam simulator to put it all together. And so this is probably one of the best ways to play Sega Saturn on an Android-based device. Now moving on to standalone emulators, we've got PSP first. So this one is going to run absolutely no problem. This is not a very demanding system, all things considered. So capping this out to a 1080p resolution or a 4x upscale is really going to be easy. There are much weaker devices that can pull this off too. The real beauty of this device is the fact that it's kind of shaped like a PSP, so it feels very natural, but then also we've got that beautiful 6-inch OLED display, which just makes everything pop too. So this is one of the best looking ways to play PSP if you ask me. Now moving on, we've got GameCube using the Dolphin emulator, and this one runs absolutely fine. We can run this at a 3x resolution upscale, which is actually going to be more pixels than what is found on the display, but it's still going to play absolutely fine. You can even throw the most demanding games at it, like Rogue Squadron 2, and you might get a couple hiccups as shaders are compiling, but after that, it'll be a very smooth gameplay experience. The Odin 3 is so powerful that you can also upscale these well beyond 3x resolution. If you wanted to go up to a 5x resolution, which is essentially 4K, you can do that. Now this display resolution is only 1080p, but it also has the ability to output via USB-C to a 4K resolution. So you could plug this into a TV or a monitor at a 4K resolution and actually play it at that 5x upscale as well. And so in general, yes, this is an excellent GameCube experience both in handheld and desktop mode. Moving on to PlayStation 2, it's a very similar experience as well. So we can do 2.5x resolution upscale, which is almost perfectly 1080p, and all these games are going to play great. Same thing with upscaling to 5x if you want to play it externally, all that will work too. Altogether, I tested out about 20 different PlayStation 2 titles, and I threw in everything from like easier to play games to the really hard to play games, and yeah, everything played very nicely. Now, of course, this is only scratching the surface of the entire PS2 catalog. There were over 4,000 games released for this console, so that would take me a lot longer to actually test all of them, but these are the standards that I usually test, and I can know immediately whether or not something is wrong, and all these played really well. There will always be a handful of games that have some problems, and it usually comes down to the game engine. We'll talk about that more later, but really when it comes down to it, any genre you can think of, sports games, driving games, fighting games, adventure games, all those played really well here on the PS2. So I would say that the vast majority of games here are going to be pretty much plug and play. I'm not going in and changing any settings here. I'm running everything with the OpenGL backend, which is a little bit more accurate, but also more demanding. And still, this is playing all these games without breaking a sweat. And it's nice to see some of these heavy-hitting games like Gran Turismo 4 or Jak 3 or God of War 2 all playing really well without having to tweak any sort of settings whatsoever. Another good example are the Sly Cooper games, which have been notoriously hard to play on Android just based on the emulation progress of this particular app and these games in particular. And so it's really nice to be able to see these games running absolutely fine without any additional tweaks. Other games that use the snowblind image, for example Baldur's Gate as well as Champions of Norath, these are also notoriously hard to play, especially on this version of NetherSX2, which is the classic version. So again, the fact that we're able to play these games at a 3x resolution upscale without having to make any other compromises is a really good sign. Now, one game that I've never seen play at full speed on Android is Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, and I've only played the first few minutes of this game just because it always seems to bog down, and this one did have some slowdown. It wasn't so bad, it was playing at about maybe 80% speed in certain parts, but at full speed in others, and so I think as far as the standard goes with this particular game, and whether or not you consider this to be playable is all going to be up to you, but if you are desperate to play this one game and you don't mind a little bit of slowdown, then this might be a good fit. Otherwise, you may still be waiting for that perfect Dirge of Cerberus handheld because the Snapdragon 8 Elite doesn't seem to get us there quite yet. Now, going back to Dolphin, this time talking about Nintendo Wii, there are a couple tweaks that I would recommend here. Number one is that I would use the OpenGL backend, and then also it's important to choose the correct shader compilation mode for your particular game. By default, it's going to be these specialized shaders, and there are certain games that just don't run well with that particular setup. You'll get a bunch of graphical glitches. And so instead, the safest one will be exclusive Uber shaders, but that's the most demanding. And then some games will work better with the hybrid Uber shaders. So you'll have to play it by ear on a per game basis. And it's very easy to set this up. You just long press on the game, then go into Edit Game Settings, Graphic Settings, and then check out whichever shader compilation mode works the best for that game. So for this game in particular, it's the exclusive one, but for other games it might be something else. So it will take a couple minutes of experimenting to see which shader compilation works the best for your game, but once you've got it saved as a per game setting, you basically never have to touch it again. And so, yeah, I would say that Nintendo Wii is fully playable. It really depends on what setting you configure, and it may come to pass that the Snapdragon 8 Elite is just more compatible with this emulator when playing Nintendo Wii, and so who knows, maybe at some point we may not have to make these tweaks either. But either way, I would say that, yeah, Nintendo Wii is going to work absolutely fine on this device once you've made a couple tweaks in the back end. Okay, moving forward one generation, let's talk about Nintendo Wii U. Now, this one is kind of hit and miss. This is the first system I found where the lack of having custom turnip drivers really does affect the gameplay. It's also worth noting that this emulator on Android is also in very early development, and so it's not really working at full speed anyway, but I do think that once we have turnip drivers available for the Snapdragon 8 Elite, it will probably improve the overall experience. There are definitely some games that play just fine, like Wind Waker HD and Yoshi's Woolly World, no problem here. But like I showed in the review video, some games will have some graphical issues. For example, Twilight Princess on the bottom left, the map doesn't work correctly, although I've seen this with other chipsets too, so I don't think it's a Snapdragon 8 Elite thing, but rather an emulation thing. The only one that really disappoints me is Breath of the Wild, because this game runs really well on this device. I can run it at 720p and somewhere between 30 and 40 frames per second, which is a very smooth experience. Like, I find this to be fully playable, if not for the flickering that happens in the background all the time. And I've seen this same issue on other Snapdragon devices, but those that can load turnip drivers. And once I load the turnip drivers, the flickering goes away. So I'm hoping that once we have the ability to use those Mesa turnip options, then yes, we will have a better experience overall with this game. And beyond just flickering, there are some games that are flat out unplayable, like Mario Tennis Ultra Smash. So I hope both the emulator gets further developed as well as those drivers. Okay, next up we have PS3 emulation, and one note I wanted to make that I got wrong in the review is I mentioned that it had been last updated in April, and that's only partially true. If we go into the About section, you can see that yes, the UI of the app was updated back in April, and so if you go to the GitHub, when you download the app, it says the latest release was in April, but the actual app itself gets updated in the background. So if we look at RPCSX right here, the latest update was in October 11th, and so it's only been about a month and a half or so since the last release, and so Even though the app does look like it was made in April, the background is still getting constantly updated. So it's very nice to see that they are still working on this. It's just a little bit unconventional in terms of new update releases. Now, as far as the games themselves, I tested out 16 PS3 games, and only a few of them had issues. So Prince of Persia, Burnout Paradise, and Enslaved would only get to the title screen, and when I tried to start up the game, it would crash. Dead or Alive 5 also had some problems too, where it would play really slowly, and then it would just freeze at a certain point. And so those 4 games in particular did not work well, but everything else I tried was actually pretty good. Now, in the US alone, there were over 1,000 PS3 games released, both digitally as well as on disc, and so it would take a long time to test out that whole catalog, but I was still surprised to find that of the 16 games that I tested, 12 of them I would consider to be playable. Now, for each of these games, I did play them at their native 720p resolution, so I'm not pushing it as hard as I possibly could to help it with upscaling, but the most important thing for me was to make sure these games were even compatible and playable. And I was surprised to find that 3D engine games like Mirror's Edge and Devil May Cry actually were surprisingly playable. I got a couple lost textures here and there, so it's not a perfect emulation experience, but this is still a pretty playable experience altogether. I think a good benchmark here would be Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. This is what I would consider to be about a middleweight game, and in testing some lightweight PCs, I found that this game will struggle to play on them, but this one usually gives me somewhere between like 40 and 50 frames per second pretty consistently. This is a game that as long as you're getting over 30 frames per second, it won't have any sort of slowdown, and so yeah, I would say this is very playable. More lightweight titles like Resogun or Fat Princess or even Afterburner Climax, there's really no issue here whatsoever. These are all going to play great. It really just comes down to whether or not the game is going to actually launch. And so I think the PS3 has got a bright future ahead of it on Android with powerful chipsets like the Snapdragon 8 Elite. This is also an app that will allow you to load custom turnip drivers, and so once we have those for this chipset, it might get even better. But all things considered, I was still pretty impressed how much PS3 was playable on this particular chipset and on this particular handheld. Okay, and then finally, our last emulated system to discuss is Nintendo Switch emulation. We've got a few different options here in terms of emulators, and I usually use my baseline as Eden. This one is a fork of Yuzu, and it's been in a lot of active development over the past year or so. And the Eden app in particular has undergone a lot of updates over the past couple months specific to the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset, and so I found in terms of compatibility, this one tends to be the best. It definitely still lags behind other devices with third-party driver support, like the Odin 2 line of devices with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but it is nice to see that many of these standards are compatible now. I mentioned this in the review, but Switch emulation is a bit of a gamble on Android just writ large, so even if you do have turnip drivers, there's no guarantee that any game is going to play perfectly just because emulation is not going to be as good as playing it natively. When you combine that with the Snapdragon 8 Elite, it just makes that risk a little bit riskier because some games that will play fine on other devices may not play fine here. To put that into context, I tested about 40 games for Nintendo Switch on this particular chipset, and I mostly use games that have been proven to work previously, so I'm not using specifically problematic games, but rather those that I would consider to be relatively playable. And among the 40 titles that I tested, there were 10 games that gave me problems. Either it was light flickering or some heavy flickering, or maybe the colors were inverted, or the game would just outright crash. And so I would say that's a pretty good summary right there, that of the games that would typically play okay on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, about 25% of those games aren't going to play correctly on the Snapdragon 8 Elite. But on the bright side, it's not the performance that's an issue at all. In fact, any of these games played absolutely fine. Anything I threw at it had excellent performance. It really came down to compatibility and whether or not the graphics looked correct. And also bear in mind, I'm playing all these games in docked mode, which is going to give you a 1080p resolution for most of these titles as well. And so they look amazing when they actually work. As far as games that have a problem, I'm going to showcase a few of them that I also showed off in my review, and also bear in mind that emulation is always a moving target, so some of these games might look better in the future. As far as games that had some light flickering issues, Octopath Traveler 2 is an excellent example where this one seems to be mostly playable, but some of the textures will flicker in the background. I also noticed something similar in Super Mario Odyssey, that the game played really well, except there were some parts where the lighting effects, like say for example at a lantern, was flickering more than I was expecting. I'd still say this game is very much playable, but not a perfect experience. Other games like Risk of Rain 2 had some pretty crazy texture issues happening in the ground, and so this is one that's a little bit more distracting than I would like. And then something like Dragon Quest III was flickering way more than I would like, so for me this was probably something that I would not enjoy. Color inversion seems to be an issue with certain games as well. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has inverted colors in the menus and in some text, but the actual gameplay is just fine. Sonic Mania is one of my favorite examples too, because the colors are inverted in this game, but it actually still looks pretty cool, but just not an authentic experience. What I generally will do is try it out on Eden first, and if I see any sort of flickering or issues, I'll try it out with the other emulators too. There are two options that I like to try. Citron, which generally has a very similar performance as Eden, and then Kenji NX, which is based off of Ryujinx, and that one just feels a lot more different, and sometimes you can get lucky with a game like Hades where it's actually playing well. But also bear in mind that there are some games that just do not like the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor's drivers, and so Ori and the Blind Forest is a good example where this one just looks really weird in both Eden and Citron. And unfortunately with Kenji NX I can't get it past the loading screen, and so this one unfortunately just doesn't seem to be working well, which is kind of a shame because this game will often play really well on lower powered devices. Another example I showed off in the review is Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. This one has its own share of problems depending on the emulator. Within Eden, it makes it so that you can't see the textures in the ground, but in Kenji NX you can't see the textures on the characters, so it is a lose-lose situation. Now the great thing about Switch emulation on Android is that there are some very active teams still plugging away and trying to make this a better experience. If we look at the pull requests for Eden, there is a ton of activity happening on these every day. In fact, after making my last review video, one of the Eden developers reached out and said, hey, for the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor in particular, try out these settings right here and see if it improves it. And right before starting this video, I tested out a few problematic games, and I was surprised to find that yes, some of them were working better. For example, Metroid Prime Remastered, which crashed on the previous version of Eden, was actually loading up. It still had some texture issues, but this is much better than it was before. So at the end of the day, yes, Switch emulation is still a work in progress on Android, but I do think that there are a lot of people dedicated to making it better, and I think that on the Odin 3, even with the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, it's going to be a better experience at some point in the future. Now beyond game emulation, let's talk about PC gaming via compatibility layers. I talked about this in depth in the review, and I wanted to touch on this again. And this is where the Odin 3 stands out from the pack, because the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, even though it doesn't have the best GPU drivers, has a lot of brute force and a lot of RAM in the Odin 3 devices, which push it over the edge and make a lot of games really playable. The whole PC gaming on Android thing is still very much bleeding edge. It's awesome that we're at the point now where we can load up Steam games, even our Steam cloud saves. This is something that we couldn't really easily do a year ago. So it is very thrilling to be able to play your local PC games on a device that was never intended to be a computer. Now, most of the games that I'm showing off here have very little tweaks to them altogether. You can always go in and try to optimize it even more, but I love the fact that the Snapdragon 8 Elite almost gets it to the point where it's kind of plug and play. And I do think this is probably one of the most exciting aspects of the Odin 3 altogether, the fact that PC games run so well on this device. They're not perfect, but they are continuing to get better. But another thing I noted in my review is that I wouldn't really consider the Odin 3 to be a PC handheld replacement either. It gets pretty close in some certain scenarios, but there's nothing like the real thing. The Odin 3 models that will do the best for PC gaming will start at around $400 and up, and that's the same price as the base LCD Steam Deck. And there is a pretty wide gap between the performance that you will get on the Odin 3 versus actually playing PC games on a handheld PC like the deck. Let's start with Hellblade. This is a game I had to run at 720p resolution low settings with FSR quality turned on just to get it to a somewhat playable state, and it was still only running at about maybe 26 frames per second on average. Meanwhile, on the Steam Deck with similar settings here, I'm getting a much smoother experience, and it looks a little bit better too. The average frame rate here is well above 60 frames. It feels a lot smoother by comparison. In fact, I would say you can probably cap this at 60 frames per second in the per game settings and have a very nice and stable experience. Another good example is Hades 2. This is a game that runs pretty well on basically any of these handhelds, including the Odin 3, but there are some graphical issues if you pay enough attention. There's a light shimmering that happens around the background as you're moving the character around, so it doesn't feel very smooth. Meanwhile, on the Steam Deck, it's a much smoother experience overall, and so this to me feels like the game should actually play. And so even though I would say that yes, Hades 2 is playable on the Odin 3, I'd rather play it it on the Steam Deck. Resident Evil 2 is another good example where it's kind of amazing that you can play this game at all on this device, but it's going to give you an average about 30 or 40 frames per second with quite a few stutters during action sequences as well, which is kind of like the worst time that you want to have stutters when playing this particular game. Meanwhile, the exact same scene on the Steam Deck is a pretty stable 60 frames per second with a couple dips here and there, but nothing like how it is on the Odin 3. And so yes, even though the games are somewhat playable on the Odin 3, and it's very exciting that they are, nothing really beats the real deal. So at the end of the day, the way that I look at it is that if a game can run on the Odin 3, it's a huge bonus. The fact that we can even play these games in the first place, and then hoping also that the cloud saves are going to work too, that's a really awesome experience, and I really think that it is the future. The fact that Valve themselves are working on an ARM-based version of SteamOS says a lot about the future of this particular platform, and I'm hoping that at some point all that work that they're doing is going to translate over to these little handhelds as well. But at the same time, if you are going to be spending $400+ on a handheld and you don't really mind the overall size of something like the Steam Deck, then I do think that you will have a better experience overall when playing PC games on the Steam Deck itself. At the end of the day, I think that the portability of the Odin 3 is what sets it apart from the Steam Deck. It's not that the games are going to play better or even play as well, but rather the fact that this thing is a lot more portable, and that might be more important to you, especially if you want something that is gaming on the go. Next, let's talk briefly about Android games, just because this is a full-fledged Android device, and yes, you're going to be able to play your Android games on it. I didn't test a ton of games, just because I was trying to save my internal storage space for the PC games that I wanted to test, which I thought was the more important factor when reviewing this device. And so I tried out a couple, like Diablo Immortal, as well as Destiny Rising, and yes, these played well. Diablo Immortal wouldn't let me use the ultra graphics settings. I had to stick to the high settings, which still looked very good, and it's a common issue with a lot of these retro handhelds where for some reason the ultra settings are not unlocked. But yes, in general, I was playing this at high settings, 60 frames per second, and it looked pretty good. For Destiny Rising, I was able to use the highest graphical settings, and I thought it looked nice and sharp and clear. And so yes, this is an excellent way to play this device, especially if you have the TPU grip, which makes first-person shooter games feel a lot more comfortable. Now, unfortunately, one thing worth noting is that Netflix does not work with this device. I think it has to do with Google Play certification, but unfortunately that means you can't run Netflix and you can't play Netflix games, which requires the app for login. Which means that unfortunately Red Dead Redemption and other games that are offered via Netflix are not going to work on this device unless they fix this with a software update. And then finally, the last note here has to do with PC game streaming. I focused on local game streaming, and one of the great things about this device is that it runs at 120 Hz refresh rate, but then also you can use apps like Apollo and Artemis to get really low latency, usually under a millisecond in decoding time. And so if you've got a PC at home and you want to stream locally while you're there, then this is going to be an excellent setup right now if you want to play some of these games without having to tax the hardware too much. And so this might be an ideal way to play some of these games if maybe the compatibility on the Switch version isn't working out, or maybe the game isn't running at full speed via something like GameHub either. Anyway, that's really it for this showcase. I just wanted to show off all the games that I tested for the Odin 3 and where we're at right now. I'm hoping that, in a few months, we're going to get some Mesa Turnip drivers to be able to do all this testing all over again and see how much it's improved with that third-party driver solution. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.